So the race for a COVID-19 vaccine has 4 candidates close to the finish, with some preparing to roll out before the end of the year. What do the reported results mean, and how much does the dose cost? In the fast-paced world of COVID vaccines, November was particularly busy, and one vaccine has already been granted approval for emergency usage in the UK. But there are also questions that cannot be answered just yet, and Begisisa health reporter Aisha Karim is here to give us a better sense of understanding. Aisha, very good morning to you. Thank you for your time. The race for a COVID-19 vaccine has 4 candidates so far, close to a winning jab. As we assess these candidates and the impact of this vaccine, what do these results mean?
Yes, so at the moment, we have results from 5 candidates. Actually, there's new data come out about another potential vaccine from China. And it's very promising results that we're seeing. And this is very exciting because we initially were not expecting to have a COVID vaccine within the space of a year. Normally, as we know, vaccine trials tend to take several years to do. But there's been several reasons why COVID has been able to accelerate its research at this pace. Firstly, because the virus is much easier to create a vaccine for than some of the other viruses that we have. And secondly, because it's been able to utilize decades of research from other fields and apply that to COVID-19 and the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And essentially, initially when we started this vaccine journey, people were only expecting to see around 60% efficacy from a vaccine, because that's in line with what we've seen with our flu vaccines. And the virus for this coronavirus is quite similar in structure to influenza. But instead, what we've seen is a large number of the results are yielding, over 90% efficacy. And essentially, what efficacy means is how well a vaccine works in a controlled trial setting. So in a trial, you're able to limit the amount of variables, and it's able to see how well the vaccine performs in an ideal distribution model. And if you say that it has 90% efficacy, it means that 9 out of 10 people who received this shot, as opposed to getting a placebo or a dummy vaccine, did not develop COVID-19 symptoms and were protected from the disease. So essentially, it's very promising to have these results so early on, and we've seen, these one of the candidates has received approval from Canada, the UK, and the US. But I think it's also important to note that there's still a lot we don't know about some of these vaccines. We only have the full data from 2 trials. The rest have only been shared through press releases. We don't have the full scientific studies that have been published. And there's also a lot of things that we'll only learn about these vaccines as they start to get rolled out on a large scale. So there are still questions that we need to answer when it comes to these particular vaccines.
We know that Health Minister Dr. Zweli Mkhize has sent out the warning, telling us that we're well into the second wave when it comes to COVID-19, and a lot of concern around movement during the festive season. As we, really look at that perception, those comments coming out of the Health Minister, and also sort of garner some sort of understanding on where we're standing with the vaccines and access to the vaccine. We also heard from the DA saying that South Africa has missed their payment deposit for the vaccine. Where does it put us as a country when it comes to accessing the vaccine, and how much of it has been bought by first world countries?
Yeah, so I think in terms of how much has been bought by other countries, it's important to note that very early on, wealthier countries were already procuring millions of doses of vaccines, and not just millions, hundreds of millions. The UK secured like 400 million doses, the US 200 million of just one candidate. And a lot of these wealthier countries were buying these doses before we had results. So they were buying millions of doses from various candidates in the hopes that one would show results. And so now that we're starting to get results from at least 5 of these potential vaccines, these countries are able to move ahead with the procurement deals that they set up very early on. South Africa, on the other hand, and a lot of developing countries we simply just don't have that expendable income. We weren't able to secure these doses and do these kinds of deals prior to knowing results because we had to make sure that when we're buying a vaccine, we're buying the one that is going to be most beneficial to us. And so even now, you'll see I know the government is pursuing some bilateral deals, which is where you procure the vaccine directly from the manufacturer. But it's still, again, too early for us to commit to which vaccine we want to be procuring. And I think a large part of that is because, as you mentioned, there is a second wave coming. And in terms of how do we stop the spread of this coronavirus and how do we, contain COVID-19 in South Africa, a large part of that will come down to a vaccine because there's this concept of herd immunity, which is enough people need to be immune to the virus where it can no longer spread. And that means that we need to make sure that enough of the population is vaccinated to have that level of immunity. And so, with some of the vaccines like Pfizer and the Moderna candidates, they're firstly very expensive. They can cost between 600 Rand to 1,000 Rand per dose. And because they require 2 doses, it's essentially, double that cost per person. And the other concern with those candidates, particularly, is the logistics of rolling them out because of the technology. It's very new and they need to be kept at very low temperatures during storage and transport. And South Africa doesn't have the refrigerators or the freezers needed to store those vaccines. So we wouldn't be able to procure those vaccines, even though they have these excellent results where we see 95% efficacy. It's just not feasible for our population because we wouldn't be able to immunize and reach enough people with that vaccine. So we need to be thinking very carefully about what vaccine we're pursuing and which one we're going to buy. And then in terms of affordability, we are also part of the agreement that you mentioned, which is the COVAX agreement, organized through the World Health Organization and the Vaccine Alliance, Gavi. And that is an agreement which aims to allow equitable access to a COVID vaccine. So it's supposed to eliminate the cost factor and make sure that all countries are able to access a COVID vaccine. But even with that agreement, the fact of the matter is billions of people around the world are going to need a vaccine, and manufacturers aren't able to make enough quickly. So even though we are part of COVAX and we are signing on to that agreement and we are putting in that initial payment, the reality is that for the next year, we're only expecting enough doses for 10% of our population. And so that also raises a lot of questions that we need to be confronting and that the Department of Health and our government is trying to answer about who receives the doses first, who are the priority groups, and how are we going to deliver this vaccine when it becomes available next year.
Aisha, very lastly, we know that a vaccine is our most powerful tool in the fight against COVID-19 and really our biggest hope for at least some form of normality. Really just looking at the conversations that have been, around, floating around, listening to what Chief Justice Mogoeng has had to say about vaccines and trying to make sense of what it would mean for, the possibilities for a harmful vaccine to be approved by health regulatory boards. Is this something that could happen?
No. So I think it's very important that we emphasize the safety of these vaccines. We have a very stringent requirements, and SAHPRA, which is our regulatory body, will be reviewing all potential candidates, and they have a it's a very serious check that we're doing because this is a huge concern. We obviously don't want people to be scared of getting the vaccine. We want people to have trust that this vaccine is going to be something that is safe and they should take. And so this is something that SAHPRA takes very seriously, and they will check. They'll go through the full data. They'll make sure we know all the risks associated with the vaccines. We also know the benefits associated with these vaccines, and ultimately, we're not going to be approving a vaccine that is dangerous to the population. And as I mentioned earlier, um, you know, having people willing to take this vaccine is essential to trying to curb the spread of COVID-19 in the country. When it comes to immunization, this is the best way that we can start returning to some kind of normal in our lives. And so, this is something that we take very seriously in terms of the safety of the vaccine, even though a lot of these trials moved very quickly. There's also protocols and the standards in place to make sure that that isn't being done at the expense of people's safety. Ultimately, we want people to be protected, and we don't want anyone to be taking anything dangerous. So it's very important that there's a lot of public trust and willingness to take this vaccine, and belief in our regulatory body that we're not going to be giving people something that's going to harm them, because we need people to get vaccinated in order to reach a certain level of immunity within our population, and that's the only way that we'll be able to move forward and contain this outbreak.
Very well. Thank you so much for your time. BBC health reporter Aisha Karim there, giving us a sense of what the latest COVID-19 vaccine results mean for South Africa.